The hymn book trembled slightly in Friedrich Keller's hands, though the church itself was still. It was a plain wooden building with whitewashed walls and tall, arched windows that let in the soft autumn light of rural Iowa. Outside, beyond the gravel parking lot and a grove of maple trees losing their leaves, the barbed wire fences of Camp Algona were just visible on the horizon, a reminder that he was, in every legal and military sense, still a prisoner of war. Yet here, on this Sunday morning in 1944, standing awkwardly at the back of a small-town church in a uniform that no longer symbolized anything but defeat, he was something else entirely, a guest. The invitation had come 2 days earlier, delivered in halting German by a young U.S. Army sergeant supervising the work detail at a nearby farm. Friedrich had been part of a group of POWs assigned to harvest corn on the Miller family's property. They had expected nothing more than hard labor and silence. Instead, when the day's work ended, the Miller's eldest daughter had appeared with a wicker basket of sandwiches and a shy smile. Her father, a weathered man with sunburned skin and calloused hands, had asked if any of them might wish to attend Sunday service with his family. At first, no one spoke. It was a trap. Surely, some sort of propaganda performance or humiliation. But curiosity, and perhaps a hunger for something resembling humanity, had prompted Friedrich to raise his hand. Now, 2 days later, he stood among pews filled with Americans whose sons might have been fighting men like him in Normandy or the Ardennes. Every fiber of his training told him this was dangerous ground. These people were supposed to hate him, to despise everything he represented. Yet when the first hymn began and congregation's voices rose around him, a soft, rising tide of sound in a language he barely understood, no one glared. No one spat. The Miller family, seated near the front, turned and smiled gently, motioning for him to come closer. Hesitantly, he shuffled forward down the aisle, every step louder in his mind than the music itself. He had been raised Lutheran, though the faith of his youth had long ago been folded into the machinery of Nazi ideology. Chaplains at the front spoke of victory and destiny, of divine favor upon the fatherland. The sermons he had grown up with had been replaced by speeches. But here, in this modest Midwestern church with its cracked hymnals and handmade altar cloths, faith felt different. The pastor spoke not of enemies or conquest, but of forgiveness. He prayed for all who had suffered, soldiers and civilians, Americans and Germans alike. It was a notion so radical, so alien to Friedrich's experience of war, that he found himself gripping the back of the pew to steady his breath. After the service, the Millers introduced him to their neighbors as though he were an ordinary guest. A boy about 10 years old offered him a slice of apple pie. An elderly woman shook his hand and asked, with earnest curiosity, about his hometown. The conversations were awkward and broken by translation, but they were real. For the first time since his capture in North Africa, Friedrich felt something he had forgotten existed: dignity. The memory of that morning would stay with him long after the war ended. He would recall the way the sunlight fell across the pulpit, the way the congregation's voices swelled during the final verse, the way the Miller's youngest daughter had pressed a folded scrap of paper, a handwritten verse from the Gospel of Matthew, into his hand before they parted. "Love your enemies," it read. "Do good to those who hate you." He had laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it then, but later, alone in his bunk under the wide American sky, he read those words again and again until they no longer felt absurd. Friedrich had fought for a regime that taught him to see the world in terms of strength and weakness, friend and foe, master and slave. In that Iowa church, he glimpsed another possibility, one in which humanity existed even across the chasms of hatred and war. It was not a grand revelation, not a conversion or a sudden collapse of ideology. It was quieter than that, a slow, dawning recognition that the people he had been told to despise had chosen, instead, to welcome him. That realization unsettled him more than any interrogation, any defeat, any surrender. And as the bus carried him back to Camp Algona that afternoon, the barbed wire no longer felt quite as sharp, the guard towers not quite as imposing. Somewhere beyond them, a world still existed that could see a soldier not as an enemy, but as a man. The journey that brought Friedrich Keller and hundreds of thousands of other German soldiers to the American heartland began far from the quiet farms of Iowa. in the searing heat and dust of North Africa. In early 1943, the Afrika Korps, once the pride of Hitler's overseas campaigns, found itself surrounded and exhausted after years of desert warfare. At Kasserine, El Alamein, and finally in Tunisia, entire divisions were encircled by Allied forces. Supplies were gone, fuel had run dry, and Luftwaffe support had all but vanished. By the time the last Axis stronghold collapsed that May, nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms. Many believed they would never see home again. They expected to be shot, starved, or worked to death. Surrender, they had been taught, was the lowest form of disgrace, a betrayal of the fatherland and of their comrades who had fallen. Instead, they were marched to ports under the watchful eyes of British and American guards, their boots heavy with shame and uncertainty. From there, they were loaded onto Liberty ships, merchant vessels built in astonishing numbers by American shipyards. Each ship carried hundreds of men crammed into makeshift bunks deep in holds, guarded by soldiers who rarely spoke and never smiled. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks, and for many it was the longest journey they had ever taken. They spent long nights staring at the steel ceilings above them, wondering what awaited them on the far side of the ocean. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a savage land of lynch mobs and industrial slavery. Some whispered that they would be paraded through cities as trophies, or executed in secret once the war turned against Germany. The silence of the guards did little to reassure them. When the first convoys docked in New York, Norfolk, and Boston, the reality was disorienting. They were loaded onto trains, the blinds drawn to hide their routes, and carried deep into the interior of a country they had once bombed in speeches but never truly seen. The destinations were not secret interrogation sites or punishment camps, but vast enclosures built in open fields, near rivers, forests, and small towns whose names they had never heard. Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Butner in North Carolina, Camp Algona in Iowa. Rows of low wooden barracks stretched across acres of farmland, ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. Beyond those fences, children rode bicycles down gravel roads. Farmers tended fields, and church bells rang on Sunday mornings. The contrast was jarring. By the summer of 1944, after the landings in Normandy, the flow of prisoners turned into a flood. Captured Wehrmacht soldiers, some veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, others barely 18 and fresh from training, were processed by the thousands as Allied advances pushed deep into France. In Italy, too, German units caught between advancing Allied forces and partisan resistance surrendered in large numbers. By war's end, nearly 380,000 German prisoners would be held in camps across the United States, an extraordinary logistical achievement made possible by America's unmatched industrial capacity and transportation networks. What astonished many of them most was not the scale of their capture, but the character of their captivity. The camps were built to conform to the Geneva Convention, but they often exceeded its requirements. Each prisoner received adequate rations, medical care, and clothing. They were allowed to write letters home, attend classes, and even form orchestras and theater troupes. Some were assigned to labor detachments, working in canning plants, sawmills, and cotton fields, where they were paid small wages redeemable in camp canteens. Others helped harvest crops for farmers whose sons were fighting overseas. But perhaps the most bewildering part of it all was the landscape itself. They had braced for hostility, for jeering crowds, punitive marches, or relentless interrogations. Instead, they found themselves in places that seemed untouched by war. The fields stretched wide and green. The sky was vast and uninterrupted by searchlights or bombers. Townspeople sometimes waved as the guarded trucks passed by. It was as if the brutality of the Eastern Front, the devastation of the Reich cities, and the fear that had governed every moment of their military lives had been left on another planet. For many, the absence of hatred was its own kind of punishment. They had expected vengeance, but indifference was far more confusing. They had imagined enemy cruelty, but were met instead with a system designed not to humiliate them, but to contain them. And in that strange, quiet captivity, where the most dangerous thing they encountered might be a Midwestern thunderstorm or the loneliness of a Sunday afternoon, their understanding of America began to change. It was not a land of barbarians, nor a nation of cowards as they had been taught. It was something harder to categorize, A society powerful enough to defeat them on the battlefield, yet confident enough to treat them as men rather than monsters. For soldiers who had once marched under banners proclaiming German superiority, that realization was as unsettling as defeat itself. When Friedrich Keller stepped off the guarded transport truck and into Camp Algona for the first time, he was prepared for the worst. He had imagined cages, mud pits, perhaps even open-air stockades like those in the First World War. The propaganda he had absorbed in Germany spoke of enemy cruelty, of starvation and humiliation awaiting any soldier foolish enough to fall into American hands. But what he saw beyond the rows of barbed wire and the watchtowers was nothing like a prison at all. The camp stretched for acres across the rolling Iowa farmland, neat and orderly, with rows of identical wooden barracks lined up like the streets of a village. Gravel paths cut between the buildings, each marked with numbers and small signs. Beyond them were larger structures, a mess hall, a hospital, a laundry, even a chapel. It looked less like a prison and more like a small, self-contained town. The barracks themselves were simple but far from brutal. Each one housed around 40 men, with rows of wooden bunks, windows that could open for ventilation, and small iron stoves for heat in the winter. There were shared washrooms and showers, a luxury for many soldiers who had spent months living in muddy trenches or makeshift foxholes. The camp's water came from a proper treatment system, and electricity ran through every building. Conveniences that some prisoners had never experienced even in their homes back in rural Germany. A clock tower in the center of the compound rang at regular intervals, marking meal times, work shifts, and the curfews that structured life inside the wire. The mess hall was another revelation. It was not lavish by civilian standards, but it was clean, organized, and astonishingly well supplied. Meals were served 3 times a day on metal trays, with bread, meat, vegetables, and even dessert. American authorities understood something that Germany's leadership had often ignored. Hungry men were dangerous men. A well-fed prisoner was less likely to attempt escape, less likely to lash out, and far easier to manage. The rations were designed to meet not just nutritional needs but psychological ones, a demonstration that, even in captivity, the United States had resources to spare. For soldiers who had eaten grass soup and scavenged for scraps on the Eastern Front, the sight of food being served in predictable abundance felt almost surreal. But the camps offered more than shelter and meals. The U.S. military had studied the lessons of World War I, when neglect and mistreatment had fueled resentment and radicalization among prisoners. This time, they approached the problem with a mix of pragmatism and strategy. A bored prisoner could become a disruptive prisoner, so the camps were built to keep minds occupied. Libraries stocked with donated English and German books became hubs of quiet activity. Classrooms offered courses in mathematics, history, and languages, some taught by captured officers, others by American volunteers. The War Department even distributed standardized educational materials, believing that educated prisoners would return home less bitter and more receptive to democratic ideas. The recreation facilities were another surprise. Most camps had a theater where prisoners could stage plays or watch films shown by the American Red Cross. Soccer fields and volleyball courts dotted the perimeters, and competitions were organized between barracks. Music, too, became a vital outlet. Orchestras formed from captured musicians played concerts on warm summer evenings, their notes drifting beyond the wire and into nearby cornfields. For men who had expected years of monotony and degradation, these activities brought structure, dignity, and a strange sense of normalcy. None of this was purely sentimental. It was policy. The United States adhered to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which outlined the treatment of prisoners of war. Adequate housing, food, medical care, and opportunities for recreation and communication with families. But in many cases, American camps went beyond those requirements. The reasoning was not rooted in kindness. It was strategic. Healthy, well-treated prisoners cost fewer resources in the long run. They required less medical attention. They rarely staged uprisings, and they often became cooperative, even useful. Some POWs volunteered for labor details, harvesting crops or repairing roads, which helped offset the labor shortages created by the draft. Others shared information in casual conversations that provided intelligence to American authorities. Even the guards benefited. A camp full of desperate, Starving men required constant vigilance and frequent intervention. A camp where prisoners were occupied, fed, and relatively content could be managed with a fraction of the personnel. The system, in short, was efficient, and efficiency was the lifeblood of the American war effort. As weeks turned into months, the strangeness of this new world began to fade. The routines of camp life became familiar. The clang of the mess bell, the chatter in the library, the soft hum of a film projector on Friday nights. These sounds replaced the noise of artillery and the cries of wounded comrades. For many German soldiers, captivity had been their greatest fear. But behind the fences of these meticulously planned camps, they discovered something entirely unexpected, a kind of order, even dignity, that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had left behind. And in that order, many began to sense that America's strength was not only in its weapons or armies, but in its capacity to build, organize, and sustain, even for those it had defeated. It began quietly, without fanfare or official announcement, in the soft corners of rural America, where the war felt distant enough to be both real and abstract. The prisoners had been working on farms for months, cutting corn, stacking hay, mending fences, under the watchful eyes of military police. At first, they were met with suspicion. Neighbors slowed their cars when they passed the fields, children stared from porches, and farmers kept their shotguns within reach. But as summer turned autumn and the same faces returned week after week, a curious transformation began to take shape. The enemy stopped looking like an enemy. They looked like young men, exhausted, polite, often grateful for a cold drink and a word of English they were trying desperately to learn. And that was when the invitation started. The War Department had never intended for German prisoners to become part of the communities where they labored. The Geneva Convention permitted them to work in non-military industries, and American farms, short on labor with so many men overseas, were eager to hire them. The arrangement was meant to be practical. The prisoners helped harvest crops, the farmers paid a modest fee to the government, and the war effort benefited from every bale of hay and crate of produce. Yet the humanity of daily contact was harder to regulate. Farmers who saw the same group of POWs each morning began to offer more than water. They brought out sandwiches at midday. They shared cigarettes during breaks. Some even taught the men English phrases, laughing when the pronunciation stumbled. Slowly, suspicion thawed into familiarity. One Sunday, a farmer named Henry Walker in Nebraska asked the military escort a question no one had thought to ask before. Could the men come to Sunday dinner? It was a small request, rooted less in politics than in habit. Walker had grown up believing that anyone who worked on his land shared his table on the Sabbath. The guard hesitated, then radioed for permission. Hours later, the answer returned. There was no regulation against it. That afternoon, 5 German prisoners, still in their field-gray uniforms, sat awkwardly at the Walker family's oak dining table, passing bowls of mashed potatoes and listening to the laughter of children. It was an unremarkable meal in every way except one. The men on either side of that table had once been sworn to kill each other. Word spread, and what had begun as isolated gestures soon became a pattern. In small towns from Texas to Wisconsin, families who hosted POW work details began extending their hospitality beyond the fields. They invited the men to picnics, to birthday gatherings, to watch local baseball games. But the most surprising invitations came on Sunday mornings. After months of shared meals, farmers and their wives began asking if the men would like to join them at church. Some prisoners declined politely, unsure if such a thing was even allowed. Others accepted, driven by curiosity or a longing for the rituals of home. The sight was strange at first. German soldiers walking to the doors of Baptist chapels and Lutheran churches alongside the families whose sons were fighting them in Europe. They sat in the back rows, silent and respectful, their hands folded in their laps as the congregation sang hymns they half remembered from their childhoods. Pastors prayed not just for victory, but for peace, for all soldiers on all sides. It was disarming in its simplicity. These men who had expected hatred and vengeance found themselves embraced by a community that believed faith was larger than war. Military authorities, at first cautious, quietly allowed the practice to continue. There was a strategic logic to it. Prisoners who felt they were treated humanely were less likely to resist or attempt escape. those who experienced American society firsthand, its churches, its families, its rhythms of ordinary life, might return home with ideas that serve broader post-war goals. Yet, beyond the strategic thinking, something deeper was happening. The barriers between captor and captive were softening in ways no policy could have planned. By late 1944, Sunday exceptions were no longer exceptions at all. Across the country, it became common to see trucks carrying German POWs rumbling down quiet country roads, not to labor camps but to white steepled churches. Children waved as they passed. Dogs barked and followed. And inside those sanctuaries, men who had once shouted war slogans now bowed their heads in prayer beside their former enemies. It was a small, almost invisible act of grace in a world otherwise consumed by destruction. And for many of those men, it would prove more transformative than any battlefield defeat. For the first time since their capture, they were being treated not as prisoners or as symbols of fallen right, but as human beings, flawed, forgiven, and welcome in the house of God. For many of the young men who now sat quietly in American pews, their understanding of faith had been forged in a very different world. They had grown up in a Germany where religion was woven into daily life, where Lutheran hymns echoed through village churches on Sunday mornings, and Catholic festivals marked the rhythm of the seasons. Baptisms, confirmations, and weddings filled family albums, and a local pastor or priest was often as respected a figure as the village mayor. Yet by the time they were old enough to wear the field-gray uniform of the Wehrmacht, the faith of their childhood had changed. It had been reshaped, stripped of its universal compassion, and harnessed to serve a darker purpose. The Nazi regime, from its earliest days, understood the power of religion and sought to bend it to its will. Churches were not abolished. They were infiltrated. Pastors who preached doctrines incompatible with the state were silenced, arrested, or pressured into conformity. Religious symbols were subtly repurposed. Sermons that once spoke of humility and love of neighbor now often praised sacrifice for the fatherland. In some congregations, crosses shared space with swastikas, and prayers for peace were replaced with blessings for German arms. Many soldiers entered the war believing they were fighting not only for their nation, but for a divine destiny, sanctioned and sanctified by a higher power. Friedrich Keller remembered his confirmation sermon vividly. The pastor had spoken not of Christ's teachings, but of duty to Volk and Führer. Obedience, he had said, is the highest form of faith. It was a message repeated in military training, where chaplains offered prayers before battles that sounded more like political speeches than spiritual guidance. Even the language of Scripture was twisted. Verses about endurance and struggle were cited as proof that Germany's conquest was part of God's plan. Over time, faith lost its warmth and became a tool, a way to justify orders, to console mothers sending sons to war, to make dying on a foreign battlefield feel like a noble calling rather than a pointless sacrifice. By the time they were captured, many soldiers had grown cynical about religion altogether. It had failed to shield their city from bombs, failed to preserve the Reich they were told was eternal, failed to provide comfort in the trenches. What remained was a hollow ritual, words recited without meaning, prayers said without conviction. For some, bitterness set in. For others, faith simply withered from neglect. Few expected to encounter it again in captivity, and certainly not in the land of their enemies. That was why the sincerity they found in American churches was so deeply unsettling. Here, faith seemed untouched by ideology. It was not shouted from podiums or wrapped in nationalistic rhetoric. It was sung in hymns about mercy and spoken in sermons about forgiveness. Pastors prayed for soldiers on all sides, for mothers in Hamburg as well as in Chicago, for peace that would heal more than just one nation, to men who had only known religion as a weapon of propaganda. Such prayers sounded almost naive, and yet they also felt disarmingly genuine. The difference was most striking in the small gestures. Congregants did not ask about their allegiance or demand contrition. They shook hands, offered hymnals, shared meals, and asked about families left behind in Saxony or Bavaria. Faith here was not a banner under which to rally, but a table around which to gather, and that quiet inclusiveness had a power none of them expected. It stripped away the layers of indoctrination and reminded them of the faith they had once known, the faith of their childhoods, before uniforms and orders and slogans had twisted it into something unrecognizable. Some resisted the feeling, telling themselves it was a trick or a calculated display meant to soften them. But others, in unguarded moments, felt something they had not felt in years: comfort. The hymns that filled the church halls were not so different from the ones their mothers had sung. The prayers for peace echoed the whispered hopes they had carried into battle, but never dared to speak aloud. In those spaces, surrounded by people who should have hated them, faith began to mean something again, not as a justification for conquest, but as a bridge across the abyss that war had carved between them and their humanity. For many, it was a first step toward a painful reckoning. They began to question how their homeland, the land of Luther and Bach, had allowed faith to become a tool of tyranny. They wondered if obedience to orders had blinded them to deeper truths, and they began to suspect that the war had not just destroyed nations, it had eroded the spiritual foundations of their own souls. The quiet sincerity of American churches did more than comfort them. It confronted them. It reminded them of what faith could be, and of how far their own had fallen under the shadow of the swastika. The first time Heinrich Bauer heard the invitation, he thought he had misunderstood the English. The words seemed too casual, too out of place in the heat and dust of a Texas farm. It was a Saturday afternoon in late September 1944, and he had just finished repairing a stubborn piece of farm machinery, an old John Deere tractor with a leaking fuel line. Heinrich had been a mechanic with the Afrika Korps, captured near Bizerta the previous year after Rommel's forces were finally crushed in North Africa. Since then, he had been shipped halfway across the world, first by freighter to New York, then by train to Camp Hearn, one of the many prisoner of war camps scattered across the American South. From there, he had been assigned to a small group of POWs sent out on work details to local farms. The work itself was monotonous but tolerable, harvesting cotton, fixing machinery, stacking hay, and Heinrich had resigned himself to it. What he had not expected was the kindness. The McAllister family, who owned the land, treated the prisoners not as dangerous enemies, but as hired help. They brought them lemonade during breaks, left extra bread with their lunches, and occasionally offered them books from their own shelves to help them learn English. It was disarming, and Heinrich remained wary. His training, his upbringing, and the regime that had shaped him had all taught him that enemies would be feared, despised, or at the very least distrusted. Yet here he was, wiping grease from his hands with a cloth that Mrs. McAllister had handed him with a smile, while her son asked about life in Germany as if they were old friends. "Tomorrow," Mr. McAllister said, leaning against the tractor with his hat tilted back, "we're heading into town for Sunday service. You're welcome to join us if you'd like." The words hung in the air, strange and almost surreal. Heinrich looked around, half expecting to see the guard react, but the military escort, a young corporal with a rifle slung loosely over his shoulder, merely shrugged. It wasn't forbidden. There was no rule against prisoners attending church if they were invited and supervised. Still, Heinrich hesitated. He thought about the sermons he had heard back in Germany, sermons that praised the fatherland, glorified sacrifice, and cast the enemy as subhuman. What kind of sermon would he hear here? Would they single him out, shame him, force him to stand as an example of the defeated enemy? He almost declined, ready to retreat back into the safety of the barracks and the familiar rhythm of captivity. But something inside him, something that had been buried under discipline and doctrine, stirred. It was curiosity, yes, but also something deeper, a longing for the ordinary, for a fragment of civilian life that felt like it belonged to the world before the war. Against his better judgment, Heinrich nodded. The next morning, he climbed into the back of McAllister's truck with his fellow prisoners and rode into town. The journey was short, just a few miles down a dirt road lined with pecan trees and cotton fields, but for Heinrich it felt like crossing an invisible line. He kept his eyes low as they entered the church, conscious of the stares from the congregation. Children whispered to their parents. Men in worn suits glanced curiously over their shoulders, and a few women clutched their handbags a little tighter. But no one spat. No one shouted. Instead, an usher with graying hair and gentle eyes pressed a hymnal into his hands and gestured toward an empty pew. The service itself was unlike anything he had expected. The pastor spoke not of victory or vengeance, but of forgiveness and grace. He prayed for soldiers on every side, for families waiting at home, and for a peace that might heal the wounds of war. Heinrich followed along as best he could, stumbling over the unfamiliar English words of the hymns. At one point, he caught Mrs. McAllister smiling encouragingly at him from the row ahead. It was a small gesture, but it felt like something monumental, a recognition that he was not merely a prisoner, not merely an enemy, but a human being worthy of kindness. After the service, the McAllisters insisted he join them for lunch. They shared roast chicken and cornbread at their kitchen table, speaking in slow English and patient gestures, asking about his family and his home. Heinrich answered haltingly, his voice rough from disuse, but with each exchange the distance between them seemed to shrink. That night, back behind the barbed wire of Camp Hearn, Heinrich lay awake, replaying the day in his mind. He had expected humiliation, perhaps even hostility, but what he found instead was something far more confusing and far more powerful. The invitation had been sincere. The prayers had been genuine. The kindness had not been a trick. For the first time since his capture, he felt a small, unfamiliar warmth stirring in his chest. It was hope, fragile, tentative, and deeply unsettling, but hope nonetheless. And it would not be the last time he felt it. The first Sunday service Heinrich attended stayed with him for the rest of his life. It began with the smallest, most ordinary gestures that were more powerful than any display of force he had ever witnessed. As he stepped through the wooden doors of the white-steepled church, the air cool and scented faintly of old hymnals and polished pews, he felt every eye in the congregation turned toward him. He braced himself for hostility, for the hard stares and tight jaws he'd come to expect from civilians in the aftermath of battle. Instead, a boy no older than 12 hurried forward with shy smile, holding out a war hymnal with both hands. The boy's fingers trembled slightly as he offered it, but his gaze did not waver. "Here, sir," he said softly, the unfamiliar English words heavy but clear. Heinrich took the book carefully, as though it might break, and managed a nod. Inside, the congregation shifted to make space in the pews. The McAllisters led him to a seat halfway down the aisle, and as he passed, people nodded politely, even warmly. An elderly woman with silver-white hair extended her hand. It was soft and cool, and she clasped it as if greeting an old neighbor rather than an enemy soldier. "Welcome," she said simply. The words struck him harder than any accusation could have. He had been called many things during the war: invader, Nazi murderer, but never welcome. The service began with music. The organ filled the small church with a sound that resonated deep in Heinrich's chest, stirring memories of childhood Sundays back in Württemberg before uniforms and orders had replaced innocence. The congregation rose to sing, and he followed clumsily, stumbling over the unfamiliar English words but recognizing the melody. The hymn was one he had heard in German as a boy, sung in the same reverent tones. Across nations and oceans, across politics and propaganda, the music was unchanged. The realization unsettled him. The people he'd been taught to see as lesser, as weak and decadent, were singing the same words of faith his mother had whispered to him before bed. Then the pastor began to speak. His voice was calm and steady, carrying across the wooden rafters. He prayed for American soldiers fighting in Europe, but he also prayed for their enemies, for German soldiers, for their families, for their safe return. He prayed for mothers in Hamburg and Munich who waited for letters that would never come. He prayed for the wounded, the captured, the grieving, all without distinction. Heinrich felt a knot tighten in his throat. Never, not once in all his years of service, had he heard a prayer offered for the other side. In Germany, sermons spoke of divine justice and inevitable victory, of enemies who deserved their fate. Here, there was no hatred. There was sorrow, and a plea for healing that seemed to include even him. During the exchange of peace, people reached for his hand without hesitation. Some offered quiet words he didn't understand. Others simply smiled. Children peeked over pews to study him, and when he caught their gaze, they giggled and hid their faces behind hymnals. A young girl with a ribbon in her hair pressed a folded paper into his palm, a drawing of a dove carrying an olive branch. He stared at it for a long moment, unsure how to react. No one had ever given him a gift without wanting something in return. The service ended with a benediction, and as the congregation filed out, several people approached to speak with him. Their questions were gentle, curious rather than accusatory. One man asked about the weather in North Africa, another about German food. They spoke of their own sons overseas and asked if he had brothers. They did not flinch from his accent or recoil from his uniform. They treated him impossibly as a man rather than a monster. On the ride back to camp, Heinrich sat in silence, his thoughts a tangle of confusion. He had been trained to see Americans as soft, decadent, soulless. Their society, he was told, was built on greed and self-interest. Their people too weak to understand discipline or sacrifice. Yet what he had encountered in that church was neither weak nor decadent. It was powerful in a way his commanders had never described, a strength that came not from hatred or domination, but from grace. That night, long after the lights in the barracks had gone out, Heinrich pulled the small drawing of the dove from his pocket and stared at it under the faint glow of a guard tower searchlight. He thought of the boy with the hymnal, the woman who had shaken his hand, the prayer for German soldiers. None of it fit into the worldview he had carried into the war. It was as though the ground beneath his certainties had shifted. For the first time, he wondered if the real battle was not being fought in the fields of France or the deserts of Tunisia, but here, in the quiet, stubborn humanity of people who refused to hate him. And in that realization was a warmth he could neither explain nor forget. For Heinrich and many of the men who sat beside him in those wooden pews, the greatest shock of captivity was not the food, the comfort, or even the kindness. It was a message they heard from the pulpit. It was a message that ran directly counter to everything they had been taught, not just as soldiers, but as Germans living under the shadow of the Third Reich. Their world had been one where strength was virtue and mercy was a defect, where compassion signaled softness and softness was weakness. Everything in their training, in their education, in the speeches blasted from radios and echoed in parade grounds, reinforced a single belief, that the world was divided between the strong and the weak, and only the strong deserved to survive. The ideology of National Socialism had deliberately sought to replace the language of grace with the language of power. Hitler's rhetoric was not about forgiveness but destiny, not about loving one's neighbor but conquering him. The state glorified hardness, the hardness to kill, to endure, to obey without question. Children in the Hitler Youth were praised for their cruelty toward the unfit. Soldiers were told that pity had no place in war. Even Christianity, once a quiet force in German life, was repurposed to fit the state's ambitions. Verses about sacrifice were twisted into endorsements of military obedience. Christ was reimagined not as a savior who forgave enemies, but as a warrior who embodied struggle and triumph. Sermons from compliant pastors echoed the same message as party rallies. Mercy was for fools and compassion for the weak. That worldview had been drilled into Heinrich since he was a boy. He had internalized it without question, believing it to be a simple truth of life. But sitting in an American church, listening to a pastor pray for the souls of the enemy and watching families embrace men they had every reason to despise, he felt the ground beneath that belief begin to crumble. It was not just that these people believed differently, it was that they lived differently. Their entire society seemed built on the idea that kindness was not a liability, but a strength. Forgiveness, they believed, was not capitulation but courage. The enemy was still an enemy, but he was also a human being, capable of suffering, redemption, and grace. This theological reversal left many prisoners deeply unsettled. It was one thing to lose a war to an enemy with superior tanks, planes, and ships. It was another to discover that your enemy's moral code was stronger, too. Some tried to dismiss what they were seeing as hypocrisy, a trick meant to weaken them. Others resisted the implications, retreating into cynicism and old prejudices. But even those who rejected the message could not entirely ignore its effect. The sermons, the prayers, the gestures of kindness, they planted questions in their minds that no propaganda could silence. If compassion was truly weakness, why did these people seem so strong? If mercy made nations crumble, why was America growing more powerful by the day? For Heinrich, the contradiction gnawed at him. He remembered the words of a Nazi officer who had once lectured his unit. "We will build a world without pity." At the time, those words had filled him with pride. Now, they filled him with unease. A world without pity was a world without humanity, and the people who had supposedly been soft and decadent were showing more resilience than he had ever imagined possible. They had defeated him not just on the battlefield, but in their refusal to become what they hated. In the weeks that followed, Heinrich found himself listening more closely to sermons, even when he only half understood the English. He studied the faces of the congregation as they prayed for those who had wronged them, and he wondered if they knew how profoundly their words challenged the very foundations of his upbringing. He thought of the mothers who prayed for sons who had died fighting men like him, and yet still prayed for souls of those same men. It was a kind of moral strength he had never encountered before, one that frightened him because it exposed the frailty of the ideology he had lived by. The clash between gospel and Reich ideology did more than unsettle prisoners. It stripped away their excuses. They could no longer claim that the world was divided into oppressors and victims, that cruelty was necessary for survival. They saw, with their own eyes, that a society could be both powerful and merciful, disciplined and compassionate, victorious and forgiving. It was a lesson that would linger long after the war ended, for men who had marched beneath banners proclaiming a 1,000-year empire built on strength. It was disorienting to realize that true strength might lie not in conquest, but in the ability to forgive. And once that idea took root, it was impossible to unlearn. The first time Heinrich stepped across the threshold in an American home, it felt more perilous than crossing any battlefield. He had survived artillery bombardments and desert ambushes, but nothing prepared him for the simple, disarming intimacy of a kitchen filled with the smell of roast chicken and fresh bread. The McAllisters had insisted, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, that he and 2 other prisoners join them for Sunday lunch after church. He had tried to refuse at first, out of politeness or perhaps fear, but Mrs. McAllister would hear none of it. "You've worked hard," she said, smiling as though she were speaking to an old friend. "Now you'll eat." And so, still wearing the uniform of a defeated army, Heinrich found himself seated at a family table in the heart of Texas, unsure where to place his hands or how to act. The room was alive with small, familiar sounds, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of gravy poured from a pan, the low hum of a radio playing faintly in the next room. Yet nothing about the moment felt ordinary to Heinrich. He watched as Mr. McAllister carved the chicken with slow, deliberate strokes and passed around steaming platters of vegetables. A basket of warm bread appeared beside him, and he hesitated before taking a piece, his fingers brushing the edge of the tablecloth as it confirmed it was real. For a moment, he felt as though he had stepped out of the war entirely, back into a world where families gathered around tables and spoke of crops and weather rather than campaigns and casualties. The conversation at first was halting and cautious. Heinrich's English was clumsy, and the McAllisters spoke slowly, pausing often to make sure he understood. They asked about his home, a small town in Württemberg, and he described it as best he could. The vineyard-covered hills, the church steeple visible from every window, the winters that painted the rooftops white. They asked about his family, and he spoke softly of his mother, who wrote to him once a month, and his younger sister, who had taken over the family shop. In turn, they told him about their son fighting in France, about the harvest that year, about the town's annual fair. It was simple, unremarkable conversation, yet every word chipped away at the invisible wall that had stood between them. Mrs. McAllister poured coffee after meal, and as they sipped it, Heinrich found himself laughing for the first time in months. The youngest daughter had asked him how to say "thank you" in German, and when he taught her, she repeated it over and over, each attempt more exaggerated and theatrical than the last. Soon the whole table was laughing, prisoners and captors, enemies and strangers, united for a moment by something as ordinary as a mispronounced word. For Heinrich, that afternoon became a turning point. The war had taught him to see Americans as faceless adversaries, an industrial machine bent on destroying everything he held dear. Yet here, in a modest farmhouse kitchen, they were not enemies. They were parents and children, farmers and storytellers, people with fears and hopes as fragile as his own. Their son was fighting a war they did not fully understand, just as he had been. Their prayers were for peace, not conquest, just as his mother's were. That realization settled over him with a quiet, humbling weight. The McAllisters, too, were changed by the experience. Before the POWs arrived, they had pictured German soldiers as hardened ideologues, cold and unfeeling. But across their kitchen table sat a young man who missed home, who worried about his family, who laughed when a child mispronounced a foreign word. He was not so different from their own son. The uniform did not define him. The shared humanity beneath it did. Such meals became common across America as the months wore on. Families invited POWs into their homes not out of political intent, but simple decency. Yet those quiet lunches and slow conversations did what propaganda never could. They softened hatred, dissolved suspicion, and replaced fear with familiarity. They were small acts of diplomacy, waged not with treaties and speeches, but with coffee cups and stories shared over dessert. When Heinrich returned to camp that evening, the guards searched him as usual, and the gates clanged shut behind him. Yet something was different. The fences no longer felt like impenetrable barriers. Beyond them lay people who had seen him not as a threat, but as a guest. And in that simple act of hospitality, something profound had shifted. The war was still raging continents away. But here, at a kitchen table in rural Texas, the first fragile threads of peace were already being woven. The first letter Heinrich wrote after that Sunday lunch was unlike any he had sent before. It was a quiet evening in the barracks, the kind that fell soft and heavy across the camp after a long day in the fields. A single bulb flickered above the wooden table where he sat, pencil in hand, staring at the thin sheet of Red Cross stationery. He had written many letters since his capture, formal, restrained messages about his health, the weather, and the progress of the war, careful to avoid anything that might be censored. But this time, the words refused to stay small. Something had shifted inside him, and he needed his family to know. He began tentatively, with the usual reassurances. "I am well," he wrote. "The work is not too hard. The camp is safe." But soon the lines took on a different tone, one that surprised even him. He described the church service, the prayers offered for German soldiers, the old woman who shook his hand and called him welcome. He told him about the Sunday meal, about the roast chicken and laughter, about the little girl who learned to say "danky" and made everyone laugh. "They treat us with kindness," he wrote, "real kindness. They pray for us, not just for victory, but for our souls. They share their tables with us." Are these truly the people we were told to hate? Across the camps of America, thousands of similar letters were written by German prisoners. Some described the comfort of warm meals and medical care. Others spoke of conversations with farmers and children, of books shared, of jokes exchanged across language barriers. Many confessed bewilderment that bordered on disbelief. "The Americans are not as we were told," one prisoner wrote to his wife from a camp in Kansas. "They are strong, yes, but also generous. They believe mercy is strength." It is a strange thought, one I cannot stop thinking about. Not all of these letters reached their destinations. German authorities were deeply aware of the power such words could have on a home front already strained by bombings, shortages, and growing doubt. Mail from POWs was carefully monitored, and anything that hinted at sympathy for the enemy was often seized and destroyed. Soldiers who wrote too openly about their treatment sometimes found their letters returned with black ink lines crossing out entire paragraphs. Others received word from home that their families had never seen the letters at all. "They fear our words," Heinrich told a fellow prisoner after hearing that his sister had not received his last letter. "They fear that kindness will do what their bombs cannot." Yet some letters slipped through, smuggled past censors, or disguised in carefully chosen phrases. Those that did were often read and reread by families who could hardly believe what they described. Mothers wept at the thought of their sons being treated with dignity. Fathers, once furious at the enemy, found their anger softening as they read about shared meals and prayers for peace. And somewhere deep in the machinery of the Reich, officials realized that these small, personal stories pose a far greater threat to morale than any enemy broadcast. The words themselves carried a quiet revolution. They undermined the carefully constructed image of America as a decadent, soulless land. They painted a picture of a nation not only powerful but principled, not only victorious but humane. And for many who wrote them, the act of putting those thoughts on paper forced them to confront their own doubts. The soldiers had been taught that mercy was weakness, that enemies were subhuman. Yet they had seen with their own eyes that mercy could be stronger than hate, and that those subhuman enemies could be more human than they had ever been allowed to believe. For Heinrich, the simple act of writing those words changed him. Each letter was more than a report. It was a reckoning, a way of making sense of a world that had suddenly turned upside down. The people he had been told to despise had opened their homes to him. They had prayed for his safety, not his destruction. They had treated him not as a captive, but as a man. And each time he described these things on paper, the distance between what he had been taught and what he now knew grew wider. Months later, when Heinrich finally received a reply from his mother, her words were cautious but revealing. "It comforts me," she wrote, "to know that you are treated well. It comforts me even more to know that there is kindness in this world, even in the hearts of those we once called enemies." He read those lines over and over, folding and unfolding the fragile paper until it was worn soft at the edges. It was proof that the truth had reached her, that his words, small as they seemed, had crossed the chasm that propaganda had built. And in that, Heinrich found a strange, steady hope that the letters, even the ones burned by censors, had begun to do their quiet work. They were sowing seeds of doubt and understanding, of reconciliation and humanity, seeds that might one day grow into something larger than the war itself. By the winter of 1944, the lines between prisoner and host had grown softer than anyone could have imagined when the first German soldiers stepped off the transport ships. What had begun as guarded work details and tentative Sunday invitations was now, in many places, something far more human. The war still raged across Europe, and news of battles in the Ardennes and the relentless Allied advance filled the newspapers, but inside the quiet, barbed wire perimeters of America's POW camps, a different story was unfolding, one written not in orders and strategies, but in friendships formed under improbable circumstances. The children were often the first to bridge the divide. They were too young to remember the speeches that had demonized the enemy, too innocent to carry the heavy weight of hate. On the edges of farm fields and outside camp fences, they gathered to watch the German workers, waving shyly until someone waved back. Curiosity overcame fear quickly. Soon they were approaching with notebooks, asking the prisoners how to say hello or thank you in German. The men, amused and a little touched, indulged them, teaching simple words, laughing at mispronunciations, and in turn learning bits of English. What began as a game grew into ritual. Children brought books to show the prisoners, or small drawings folded into paper airplanes that sailed over the fence. In return, the Germans carved wooden toys from scrap lumber or taught them songs from home. Inside the camps, cultural exchanges took root. Many prisoners had been musicians before the war, violinists, cellists, singers, conductors. With permission from camp officials, they formed choirs and orchestras, rehearsing in spare barracks after work. As Christmas approached, these ensembles began performing for the American guards and their families, their voices carrying across the winter air. They sang Still Nacht and O Tannenbaum, hymns that needed no translation. Local townspeople came to listen, some moved to tears by the haunting familiarity of the melodies. It was a strange, almost surreal sight. Men who had once marched under the swastika now standing in uniform before an audience of Americans, offering music as a gift of peace in a time of war. Even the guards, once distant and vigilant, found themselves drawn into unexpected camaraderie. Daily contact softened formalities. They shared cigarettes during breaks and swapped stories about home. Some spoke enough German to joke with the prisoners, while others learned phrases simply to pass the time more easily. On Sunday mornings, it was not uncommon for guards to accompany groups of prisoners to church, sitting beside them in pews, singing the same hymns, bowing their heads to the same prayers. Those moments blurred the rigid roles that war had imposed. Inside the church walls, they were no longer captor and captive, but men searching for the same peace, the same hope, the same redemption. Friendships sometimes extended beyond the wire altogether. Families who had grown close to certain prisoners wrote letters on their behalf, sent small gifts, or lobbied for their continued work on the farm even after the harvest ended. In some towns, prisoners were invited to holiday gatherings, where they carved pumpkins at Halloween or helped decorate trees at Christmas. These acts were technically against regulations, but the authorities often turned a blind eye. They recognized that such bonds did more to maintain order and morale than any set of rules ever could. For Heinrich, the transformation was deeply personal. What had started as polite exchanges with the McAllisters had blossomed into something resembling friendship. He was no longer just a German mechanic. He was Heinrich, the man who fixed their tractor, who taught their youngest daughter to count to 10 in German, who sang baritone in the Christmas choir. When the family's dog had a litter of puppies, they brought one to the fence for him to hold. When news came of a relative wounded in France, he wrote a note of sympathy that Mrs. McAllister kept tucked into her Bible. These gestures were small, almost inconsequential, yet they carried immense weight. They reminded him that even in defeat, he had not lost his humanity. The friendships that blossomed in those years were fragile. Some would fade after the war. Others would endure through decades of letters and visits. But they were real. They existed in the small, unrecorded moments that rarely make it into history books. A guard sharing a photograph of his newborn daughter, a prisoner repairing a farmer's plow for free, a group of townspeople standing in silence as German voices filled a church with music. These moments revealed something profound, that even in a world fractured by war, people could still recognize themselves in one another. When the gates finally opened and the war came to an end, many prisoners carried with them memories of kindness that contradicted everything they had been told. They left behind fences, but not friendships. Some writing letters for years to the families they had once labored for, others returning as visitors to places where they had first discovered a shared humanity. The war had made them enemies, but shared meals, shared prayers, and shared music had made them something else. Men who, against all odds, had found friendship behind the fences meant to keep them apart. The change did not happen all at once. It crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the way dawn slowly replaces the night. For Heinrich and countless other German prisoners, the kindness they encountered in America was not just a surprise. It was a profound contradiction, one that unsettled the very foundations of what they had believed. At first, they tried to explain it away. Perhaps the Americans were only pretending to be generous as a form of psychological warfare. Perhaps the civility was a performance meant to weaken their resolve. But the explanations never quite fit. It was hard to dismiss the sincerity of a farmer's handshake after a long day's work, or the warmth of a child's laughter as they stumbled through a German phrase, or the quiet conviction in a pastor's prayer for the enemy's safety. These were not tactics. They were glimpses of something deeper, something their own ideology had taught them did not exist in an enemy. Heinrich remembered one Sunday in particular when the cracks in his beliefs first began to widen. The pastor had spoken about forgiveness, not as a transaction, not as something earned, but as a gift freely given even to those who had done harm. The words felt like an affront. Everything he had been taught insisted that forgiveness was weakness, that enemies deserved only destruction. But the faces around him that morning, the bowed heads of people who had lost brothers and sons to the very army he had served, told a different story. They believed that forgiveness was strength. They believed that mercy was more powerful than vengeance. And in that belief, they seemed unbreakable. The realization gnawed at him for days. Could a nation that showed such compassion really be the decadent, corrupt society German propaganda had described? Could a people capable of such grace truly be enemies of civilization? The questions grew louder each time he stepped into a church, each time a stranger offered him food or conversation without fear or hate. They haunted him when he wrote letters home, and when he lay awake at night staring at the barrack ceiling. The certainty he had once carried, that his nation's cause was noble, that its mission was righteous, no longer felt as solid as it once had. He was not alone. Across the camps, other prisoners experienced the same disquiet. Some had spent their lives immersed in Nazi ideology, their worldview shaped by years of indoctrination. Yet even the most loyal among them found their convictions shaken by the evidence before their eyes. A young SS officer who had once spat at the mention of America now volunteered to teach German in a camp classroom because he admired the educational opportunities offered to prisoners. A paratrooper from Normandy, once proud of the Reich's discipline, confessed in a letter that he had seen more genuine strength in a single act of forgiveness than in 100 military parades. These were not isolated shifts. They were signs of an awakening that was spreading slowly and quietly through the prisoner population. The most painful realization for many was not that they had been wrong about America, but that they had been misled by their own leaders. The ideology they had been raised on had promised glory honor, and destiny. It had told them that they were the pinnacle of civilization, destined to rule over lesser peoples. But if that were true, why did the so-called lesser enemy treat them with such humanity? Why did their captors show them a dignity that their own regime had denied to millions? The contradiction was too glaring to ignore. It forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about the atrocities committed in their name, about the millions of innocent lives destroyed, about the moral bankruptcy of the cause they had served. Some prisoners resisted the implications, clinging desperately to the familiar comfort of ideology. But for others, the unraveling became impossible to stop. The doubts planted in church pews and around kitchen tables grew into full-blown awakenings. They began to question the orders they had followed, the slogans they had shouted, the leaders they had once worshipped. For the first time, many understood that patriotism and righteousness were not the same thing, that loyalty to a nation did not absolve of wrongdoing, and that real strength might lie not in conquest but in conscience. By the time the war neared its end, Heinrich no longer saw himself as he once had. He was still a German, still a soldier, still a prisoner, but those labels felt smaller, less defining. What mattered more were the questions he now carried, questions that would stay with him long after the fences came down. They were questions about morality, about humanity, about the kind of world that should rise from the ashes of the one that had burned. And though he had no answers yet, he sensed that the path toward them began in those quiet, unexpected moments, in the hymns sung by strangers, in the hands extended without fear, and in the realization that the enemies he had once vowed to destroy might have something vital to teach him about what it meant to be truly human. By the spring of 1945, the war that had once seemed endless was collapsing in on itself. The newspapers that reached the camps were filled with reports of Allied forces sweeping across the Rhine, of German cities reduced to rubble, of Hitler's empire shrinking by the day. The men behind the barbed wire knew what it meant. They no longer spoke of final victory or secret weapons. The bravado that had once filled the barracks, the fierce arguments about the Reich's destiny and the Führer's genius, had gone quiet. In its place was a quieter, more reflective mood, one that spoke not of glory but of survival, not of conquest but of rebuilding. And in that change, something deeper was happening. For men like Heinrich, the surrender had already begun long before the official orders reached Berlin. It was not a surrender of arms or uniforms, but of ideas, a letting go of the rigid beliefs that had once governed their every thought. The process was slow and deeply personal. It began in those church pews where they had first heard prayers for their souls. It grew stronger at the kitchen tables where they had shared meals with former enemies. It deepened in the small acts of trust they experienced each day, a guard handing over a tool without suspicion, a farmer leaving them unescorted in the field, a child waving from the side of the road without fear. Each gesture chipped away at the defensive walls they had built around themselves. By now, many prisoners had stopped counting the days until their release. Instead, they filled their time with work and learning. They volunteered for extra shifts on farms, helped repair barns, and assisted with planting for the spring harvest. They signed up for English classes held in the camp's makeshift classrooms, eager to learn the language that had once been the voice of their enemy. Some even attended lectures on democracy and American history offered by visiting professors, curious about the system that had produced a society so powerful and yet so merciful. It was as if, having been stripped of their purpose as soldiers, they were searching for a new one, a way to rebuild themselves before they returned to a shattered homeland. The conversations in the barracks reflected this transformation. Men who had once traded boasts about the superiority of German engineering now spoke about the efficiency of American agriculture. Those who had scoffed at the idea of democracy now debated how such a system might work in their own country. Even discussions about the future of Europe, once filled with bitterness, began to include words like cooperation and reconciliation. It was as if the prisoners were rehearsing for the world they hoped to return to, a world where nations competed not in destruction, but in building something better. For many, this internal surrender was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It took courage to admit that the ideals they had once embraced were flawed. It took humility to learn from those they had been taught to despise. And it took hope, a fragile but growing hope, to believe that their lives could have meaning beyond the war. The church services, more than anything else, had taught them this. In those sacred spaces, They had encountered a strength unlike anything they had known before. It was not the strength of armies or weapons, but the strength of forgiveness, a force that could disarm hatred more effectively than any gun. Heinrich felt this shift in himself most clearly one afternoon when he was assigned to a small group repairing a barn roof on McAllister Farm. The farmer handed him a hammer and left him unsupervised, trusting him completely. It was a simple act, but it carried enormous weight. A year earlier, he might have resented the trust or considered escape. Now, he climbed the ladder and worked silently, determined to prove himself worthy of it. As he hammered the final nail into place, he realized that he no longer felt like a prisoner. The fences and guard towers were still there, but inside, he was already free. This quiet surrender spread like a current through the camps. It showed in the way prisoners greeted their guards in the mornings, in the care they took with their work, in the respect they showed for the customs and faith of their captors. It showed in their willingness to speak openly about the future, not a future of revenge, but of partnership. They began to see that the world would need rebuilding, and that they, too, had a part to play in that task. By the time news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached them in May 1945, many of the men were already prepared. The capitulation of their nation was no longer a humiliation, but an inevitability, and, for some, even a liberation. They understood now that there was another kind of strength, one rooted not in conquest, but in compassion, not in domination, but in dignity. They had seen it in the churches, at the dinner tables, and in the faces of the people who had treated them not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. That realization would stay with them long after they left the camps, shaping the way they rebuilt their lives, and, in small but significant ways, the way they helped rebuild their country. When the gates finally opened in 1946 and the long lines of prisoners began boarding trains and ships for home, there was no triumphant return, no cheering crowds waiting on the docks. Germany lay in ruins. The cities they had once boasted about were now jagged skeletons of concrete and steel. Streets were filled with rubble and silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of Allied reconstruction crews and the shuffle of civilians searching for food amid the wreckage. For many of the returning prisoners, the shock of this reality was profound. They had imagined homecoming as a relief, a long-awaited reunion with the familiar. Instead, it felt like stepping into an entirely different world, one that had been broken beyond recognition. Yet within that desolation, something unexpected stirred. The men who returned were not the same ones who had left. The war had scarred them, yes, but captivity had transformed them. They carried home memories not just of defeat, but of dignity shown to them in their lowest moments. They remembered meals shared with families who had every reason to hate them, prayers spoken over them by strangers, and sermons that had challenged everything they thought they knew about strength, justice, and forgiveness. Those experiences became a compass in a country that desperately needed direction. Some former prisoners found themselves drawn back to the faith they had once abandoned. Men who had sat in the back pews of American churches now found themselves standing behind pulpits in bombed-out chapels across Germany. They preached about forgiveness not as a distant ideal, but as a living truth they had witnessed firsthand. Heinrich himself returned to Württemberg and soon began volunteering at his local church, organizing food drives for war widows and orphans. The pastor, overwhelmed by the devastation around them, often invited him to speak. Heinrich would tell the congregation about the little church in Texas where he had first heard a prayer for German soldiers, about the families who had welcomed him into their homes, about the children who had smiled at him through barbed wire. If they could forgive, he would say, then so must we. Others took their lessons beyond the pulpit. Some became teachers, determined to raise a generation that would reject hatred and nationalism in favor of cooperation and understanding. A few, shaken by their own complicity in a brutal system, dedicated their lives to peace activism. They spoke in schools, wrote essays, and joined organizations committed to reconciliation with former enemies. One former Luftwaffe officer famously founded a youth exchange program with the United States, bringing German students to stay with American families just as he had once been welcomed. It is harder to hate someone, he said, when you have shared a meal at their table. There were those, too, who entered public service, carrying the ideals they had learned behind the wire into Germany's emerging democracy. They argued for policies that prioritized social welfare international cooperation, and human rights, principles that had once seemed foreign but now felt essential. Their voices, shaped by the dissonance of their wartime experiences, helped guide Germany away from the shadows of its past and toward a future rooted in humility and responsibility. The influence of their time in captivity rippled quietly through post-war German society. It showed in the way churches rebuilt themselves not just as places of worship, but as centers of community service. It showed in the foreign policy debates where calls for reconciliation outweighed demand for revenge. It showed in the new cultural emphasis on remembrance, not as a glorification of the past, but as a caution against repeating its mistakes. For Heinrich, the lessons of captivity never faded. He married, raised a family, and built a small auto repair business. But he never forgot the Sunday mornings in Texas when he had first questioned the beliefs that had guided his life. Every Christmas, he taught his children the English carols he had learned in the camp choir. Every spring, he wrote a letter to McAllisters, who had become lifelong friends, their correspondence continuing long after the war. And every Sunday, he walked to church, not out of habit, but out of gratitude for the place where his understanding of humanity had begun to change. The men who came home from those camps did not rebuild Germany alone, but their influence was undeniable. They carried with them a living testimony, proof that mercy could be stronger than hatred, that strength could wear the face of compassion, and that even in the aftermath of unimaginable violence, reconciliation was possible. Their experiences did more than shape their own lives. They became part of the foundation upon which a new Germany was built, a nation determined not just to rise from the ashes, but to rise differently. And at the heart of that transformation were the quiet lessons learned behind fences and in pews, that enemies could become neighbors, that dignity could survive defeat, and that peace, once glimpsed, could never again be forgotten. In the years that followed the war, the memory of those Sundays lingered far beyond the boundaries of the camps. At the time, they had seemed like small gestures, a hand extended across an ocean of hatred, a shared meal, a hymn sung side by side. Yet those gestures carried a power that no tank or treaty could replicate. They did not simply offer comfort to defeated soldiers. They rewrote the terms of how former enemies could see one another. They took men who had once marched under banners of conquest and gave them a glimpse of a world built on compassion. They showed them that strength did not have to be loud or brutal, that victory could be measured not only in battles won, but in hatred disarmed. The impact of those open doors unfolded slowly, woven into the fabric of post-war history. When German prisoners returned home, they carried with them not just memories of captivity, but lessons in humanity that shaped the decisions they made for the rest of their lives. They have been shown, in the most unlikely of settings, that mercy could coexist with power, that forgiveness could emerge even in the aftermath of devastation. For many, those lessons translated into action. They worked to rebuild their broken towns not with the arrogance of conquerors, but with the humility of men who had seen a different model of strength. They raised their children with a sense of responsibility rather than superiority. They taught that true patriotism was not blind obedience, but a commitment to shared human values. The effects rippled far beyond individual lives. The quiet transformation that began around kitchen tables and church pews became part of the foundation on which a new relationship between Germany and the United States was built. In the late 1940s and 1950s, as the Cold War took shape and former enemies found themselves on the same side of a new global struggle, the personal bonds forged during captivity helped ease the transition. German leaders who had once served in the Wehrmacht negotiated with American diplomats not just as political counterparts, but as people who, in some cases, had once broken bread together. Former prisoners wrote letters of thanks to the families who had hosted them. Some even returned years later as visitors, bringing their children to meet the Americans who had shown them kindness when the rest of the world had seen them only as enemies. This new relationship was not born solely out of necessity. It was nurtured by mutual respect. The seeds of that respect had been planted in those years when, instead of vengeance, Americans had chosen empathy. It was a choice that bore fruit in a post-war alliance defined not by fear, but by cooperation. Germany's integration into Western democracies, its acceptance of democratic principles, and its rapid economic recovery were shaped not just by policies like the Marshall Plan, but also by the countless, invisible acts of moral reconstruction that had taken place years earlier in church pews and family dining rooms. The story of those Sunday invitations reveals a deeper truth about the aftermath of war. The most enduring victories are not won on the battlefield. They are built in the quiet moments when hatred is replaced by understanding, when mistrust gives way to conversation, when an enemy ceases to be a caricature and becomes a person. The Americans who opened their doors to prisoners were not simply being charitable. Whether they realized it or not, they were engaging in one of the most profound forms of nation building. The reshaping of hearts and minds, the redefinition of what it meant to be on opposite sides of a conflict. For Heinrich and others like him, the legacy of those moments lasted a lifetime. They told their children about the families who had welcomed them, about the prayers that had included their names, about the day they realized that humanity was larger than any ideology. And those stories, passed down across generations, became part of shared history that bound two nations together. Today, when American and German soldiers serve side by side in peacekeeping missions, when students cross the Atlantic to study in each other's universities, and when the two countries collaborate as partners rather than enemies, the roots of that alliance trace back to those small, seemingly insignificant gestures during a time of war. The open doors of those Sunday mornings did more than ease the burden of captivity. They transformed enemies into neighbors and suspicion into trust. They showed that even amid the wreckage of war, the future could be rebuilt on something stronger than fear, on shared values, mutual respect, and the stubborn belief that reconciliation is always possible. And in that sense, the legacy of those invitations lives on, not as a footnote to history, but as one of its quiet, enduring triumphs.